December 23, 1944. A stone farmhouse on the edge of a Belgian hamlet is pouring white smoke from every window. 2 grenades have just gone off inside it. Through the smoke, you can hear men screaming in German. A 22-year-old staff sergeant from a river bend in northern Alabama stands at the door. He has just thrown it open. Inside that house are 35 soldiers of the Waffen SS. The same division that, 6 days earlier, had marched 84 disarmed American prisoners into a field at a Belgian crossroads and machine-gunned them where they stood. The sergeant levels his submachine gun. He fires. He kills 20 SS men. Then a burst from the back of the house tears through his shoulder, his chest, and his stomach. The same fire kills his comrade across the road. The sergeant staggers back outside. He bleeds into the snow. He waits for the 15 survivors to come out with their hands up. They do not come out. So he stands back up, 3 bullet wounds in his torso, and he walks back in. This is the true story of Staff Sergeant Paul Bolden, Company 1, 3rd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division. This is the story of Petit-Coo, Belgium, on December 23, 1944. And this is the story of a Medal of Honor that almost no one alive today has ever heard of. Hobbs Island is not really an island. It is a low finger of Alabama farmland that curls into a bend of the Tennessee River, about 10 miles south of Huntsville in Madison County. In 1922, it had no paved roads and no electricity worth speaking of. A child born there that summer was born into a world that had not changed much in 50 years. There were fields, a river, and family. The Tennessee River marked its western edge, and beyond the river was more farmland, and beyond that more horizon. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's grandparents and expected their children to know each other's children. Paul Bolden was born on June 15, 1922, in his parents' farmhouse along Farley Road near Hobbs Island Road. His father was known locally as Sam Bolden, a tenant farmer who worked the same land his neighbors had worked for generations. His mother was Jean Winkles Bolden. Paul grew up doing what farm boys in northern Alabama did in the 1920s and 30s. He plowed, he planted, he hunted the woodlands along the river, and he fished the Tennessee. He attended school when the seasons allowed it. He was, by every account that survives, a slender, quiet young man. There was nothing loud about him. He did not seek attention. He did what needed doing and came home. Nothing in his childhood or adolescence marked him for what was coming. Then, in 1941, the world reached Hobbs Island. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th sent draft notices across every county in America, but Bolden did not wait to be drafted. In October of 1942, he enlisted at Madison, Alabama. He was 20 years old, and he had made a decision. The Army assigned him to Company 1 of the 3rd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division. He was given a rifle, a uniform, and a serial number, 34396-135. He began training with men from across the South, most of them roughly his age, most of them just as quiet about why they had come. He could not have known it then, but he had just joined one of the most tenacious American infantry divisions in the European theater of the war. The 30th Infantry Division carried a heritage from the First World War. Organized from National Guard units drawn from North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, it had been nicknamed Old Hickory, in honor of those states' most famous son, President Andrew Jackson. In the First World War, the 120th Infantry, the same regiment Paul Bolden would serve in, had helped crack the Hindenburg Line at Bellicourt on September 29, 1918. That action earned the regiment a permanent place in American Army tradition. 2 decades later, the division was federalized, rebuilt, modernized, and placed under the command of Major General Leland Hobbs. Its men trained hard. By the time they shipped out, they had been preparing for combat for more than 2 years. The division sailed from Boston Harbor on February 11, 1944, and arrived in England 11 days later. On June 11, 1944, 5 days after D-Day, it landed at Omaha Beach and was thrown immediately into the grinding work of the Norman hedgerows. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a kill zone. The division fought through Normandy yard by yard through June and July. In late July, it helped lead the breakout at Saint-Lô, the operation that finally cracked the German defensive line in France and sent Allied forces racing east. Then, in August, the 30th moved into what was supposed to be a quiet sector near the French town of Mortain. It was not quiet. On August 7th, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a massive armoured counterattack at Mortain, sending 4 panzer divisions westward in a desperate attempt to cut off the Allied forces advancing through Normandy and reach the port of Avranches. Hitler believed the move could reverse the entire campaign. The brunt of the blow fell directly on the 30th Division. Elements of the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry, the same regiment Paul Bolden served in, were surrounded on a rocky height called Hill 314 east of Mortain, along with attached elements from the regiment's 3rd Battalion. About 700 Americans in total were cut off. They had no food, no water, and ammunition that was running out faster than anyone had planned for. They held for 5 days. American transport aircraft flew supply missions over the hill, dropping food, ammunition, and radio batteries by parachute. About half the drops fell into German territory. The men on the hill watched their supplies land in the wrong fields and could do nothing about it. What reached them was never enough. Then the 230th Field Artillery Battalion tried something that had not been done before. They hollowed out smoke shells and packed the canisters with bandages, sulfanilamide powder, and morphine syrettes, then fired them into the American perimeter from howitzers positioned several kilometers away. Some of those shells broke apart on impact or ricocheted in the darkness and were never found. Others came apart in the air, but enough reached the men on the hill to help. The medics worked with what they could recover, and the line held. When relief finally broke through on August 12, only 376 men walked down from that hill. The Old Hickory Division had stopped Hitler's last major counterattack in France. The counteroffensive had failed. The German armoured force in Normandy would never recover. Paul Bolden was in the fighting around Mortain during those same days. On August 12, 1944, he and a fellow soldier volunteered to cross into enemy-held ground to recover airdropped supplies that had fallen on the German side of the line. They crawled deep into German positions and recovered the supplies under continuous fire. The divisional commander awarded him the Silver Star for that action. He was 22 years old and had been in combat for 2 months. From Mortain, the 30th Division pushed east. It breached the Siegfried Line in September. It helped encircle the German city of Aachen in October of 1944, the first German city to fall to Allied forces in the war. Through October and November, the division fought in and around Germany's western border. It went into a rest area in late November. The men had been fighting since they came ashore at Omaha Beach in June. They were tired in the way that soldiers get tired after months of combat. Not just physically, but in a deeper way that is harder to recover from. Paul Bolden, by then a staff sergeant and a squad leader, had a Silver Star and a Bronze Star. He was known in his company as a man who led from the front and rarely said more than he needed to. The German army had other plans for their rest. At dawn, on December 16, 1944, roughly 30 German divisions slammed westward through the snow-covered Ardennes forest in the largest German offensive on the Western Front since the fall of France. Hitler called it Watch on the Rhine. The Americans would call it the Battle of the Bulge. It was America's costliest battle of the entire Second World War. The attack hit along an 80-mile front through Belgium and Luxembourg. The Germans had massed in near total secrecy behind the forest line, and the American units they struck had almost no warning. The northern shoulder of the attack belonged to the 6th SS Panzer Army. And at the very tip of that army's spear was a single armoured column called Kampfgruppe Peiper, named for its commander, SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, 29 years old, a veteran of campaigns in France, the Eastern Front, and Italy. His force numbered roughly 4,800 men and 800 vehicles, including 117 tanks supported by armoured half-tracks, artillery pieces, and anti-aircraft guns. He had been given a single corridor to drive through at maximum speed, bypass any resistance, capture American fuel depots along the way, and reach the Meuse River before the Allies could react. His orders, as later described by his own army commander under interrogation, were to drive recklessly and give no quarter. Peiper's column moved fast from the moment it crossed the start line. On December 17, it overran an American convoy near a crossroads called Bourgnes, just south of the Belgian town of Malmedy. The Americans were mostly rear area technicians from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. They had no way to fight back against tanks. They raised their hands and surrendered, They were disarmed and marched into an open field beside a roadside cafe. Then SS tank machine guns opened fire on them where they stood. 84 American prisoners were killed at Bogniers Crossroads. 43 escaped by lying still among the bodies and crawling to American lines that afternoon, reaching the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion near Malmedy. They reported what had happened within hours. By the following morning, the report was on the desk of the First Army Chief of Staff. Within hours, it was on Eisenhower's desk. By evening, it was in every American unit on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. The men of the 30th Division heard about the Malmedy massacre within a day of arriving in the sector. They knew exactly which division had done it, and they knew they were about to fight that same division. The 30th was pulled from its rest area on December 17 and rushed south by truck through a freezing night. Men stood in open vehicles as the convoy moved through roads clogged with traffic moving in every direction. The division was fed into the triangle between Malmedy, Stavelot, and Stoumont. The 117th Infantry Regiment was sent to Stavelot. The 119th Infantry went to Stoumont. The 120th Infantry, Paul Bolden's regiment, was sent to hold Malmedy itself. Within 2 days, the 30th Division, together with the 82nd Airborne Division to the south and armoured task forces from the 3rd Armoured Division to the north and east, had Kampfgruppe Piper sealed inside a pocket roughly 4 kilometres across, centred on the village of La Glaise. Piper was surrounded. He was out of fuel. His supply columns had been cut off before they could reach him. His ammunition was running low. He had no way out by vehicle. He had also captured Major Hal McCown of the 1st Battalion, 119th Infantry, whom he kept at his command post while he tried to find a way to break the encirclement. Piper's relief columns, Kampfgruppe Hansen and Kampfgruppe Nittel, were trying to break through to him from the south, across the Amblève River. Hansen's grenadiers managed to cross the damaged Petit-Coo bridge on foot and push north toward a tiny crossroads hamlet near the Cascades de Cou waterfall called Petit-Coo. They could not break through. American artillery fire and the men of the 117th Infantry stopped every attempt, but the SS soldiers did not withdraw entirely. Groups of them settled into the stone farmhouses along the road, set up machine guns in windows, and dug in, waiting for a corridor to open. On the morning of December 23, 1944, Company 1 of the 120th Infantry was ordered to push east from Malmedy toward Petit-Coo to clear those positions and link up with the 117th Infantry. The weather had finally begun to clear after days of overcast that had kept American air power on the ground. Fighter bombers were operating again, but the ground fight was still close and brutal, building by building, road bend by road bend. December 23, 1944, was a Sunday. The temperature in the Amblève Valley that morning was well below freezing. The ground was frozen solid under a cover of snow that had been accumulating for days. The men of Company I moved in the pale grey light of a Belgian winter morning, their breath visible, their weapons cold, the road ahead of them narrowing between stone walls and bare tree lines. They had been in continuous operations for a week without adequate sleep or resupply. They were tired in the particular way of men who have learned that tiredness is simply the background condition of infantry combat in December. They kept moving because moving was the mission, and the mission was the only thing that mattered right now. Company I moved up the road and walked directly into a wall of fire. A grey stone farmhouse, 200 yards to the front, contained a fortified position held by 35 Waffen SS soldiers. The citation that would later be written for Paul Bolden described what happened next in plain language. Mortar and tank artillery shells were pounding the American unit, while automatic weapons fire from the house tore across the ground in front of them. Every man who tried to move forward was pinned. The company could not go left, could not go right, and could not go forward. Every minute they stayed where they were, the mortars kept walking back and forth across them. Men were dying. The position had to be taken, and there was no obvious way to take it. It was a 27-year-old technical sergeant from Beverly, Massachusetts, who looked across at Bolden. His name was Russell Newman Snoad. Snoad was 5 years older than Bolden. He had enlisted from Massachusetts in March of 1941, more than a year before Bolden joined the army. He had been through months of European combat, through the hedgerow fighting of June and July, through Mortain, through the Siegfried Line, and into the opening days of the Bulge. He was a steady, experienced, non-commissioned officer. the kind of man that rifle companies in 1944 could not function without. He understood exactly what the situation in front of them required. So did Bolden. The two of them could see what nobody behind them could solve. The farmhouse had to be cleared from the inside, and the only way to get inside was to get to the wall first. And the only way to get to the wall was across 200 yards of open ground under fire that had already stopped the entire company. There was no cover between their position and the farmhouse wall. There was no way to flank it without a movement that would take too long and expose other men. There was only the direct approach, on the ground, in the snow. Whatever passed between them in those seconds before they moved, no witness ever recorded it. What we know is only what they did. They decided, without orders, that the only way forward was forward. The two men began crawling, 200 yards on their stomachs, in December snow, under continuous machine gun fire from a building that every other man in the company could not approach. They did not stop. They did not turn back. Bolden reached the outer wall of the farmhouse and pressed himself flat beneath a window. Snoad took up his position across the road, where he could cover the door and the approach on Bolden's side of the building. Bolden was carrying a submachine gun and 2 grenades, one fragmentation, one white phosphorus. He pulled the pin on the fragmentation grenade, let the fuse burn briefly, and pushed it through the window directly above his head. He heard it strike the floor inside. He heard it go off. Then he put the white phosphorus grenade through the same window. White phosphorus ignites on contact with air and produces a dense burning smoke that fills a room in seconds. It burns through cloth and wood, and cannot be smothered with a blanket or stamped out underfoot. Inside a sealed stone farmhouse in December, with no ventilation and 35 men trying to find cover that does not exist, it is among the most incapacitating weapons a soldier can carry through a door. Then Bolden reached for the door. He threw it open and walked inside. The official citation, published under War Department General Orders No. 73 on August 30, 1945, describes what he found. 35 SS troopers who were trying to reorganize themselves after the havoc wrought by the grenades. Bolden opened fire. He killed 20 SS soldiers. Then a burst from the back of the house found him. It tore through his shoulder, his chest and his stomach. The same fire struck Russell Snoad across the road. Bolden made it back through the doorway and pressed himself against the outside wall. 3 bullet wounds. He looked at the door. 15 men were still alive inside that house. 15 soldiers of the same division that had shot unarmed American prisoners at Malmedy 6 days before. What Paul Bolden did next is the part of this story that almost never gets told. He waited. He stood outside that door, 3 bullet wounds in his body, his comrade down across the road, and he waited for the surviving Germans to come out and surrender. Those are the exact words of the official citation. He waited for the surviving Germans to come out and surrender. Think about what that means. The 120th Infantry was operating in the same sector where the Malmedy massacre had occurred 6 days earlier. Men of this same SS division had shot unarmed American prisoners in a field at Bonnier's Crossroads. The anger in every American unit in that valley was real and deep. In some sectors, orders had circulated stating that SS troops would be shot on sight and no prisoners taken. Paul Bolden knew all of this. Every man in his company knew it, and he still waited. He gave those 15 men a chance to walk out with their hands up. He honored the rules that their own division had thrown aside at Bonnier's 6 days before. He made the choice that separates a soldier from something else entirely. They did not come out. The seconds stretched. The company behind him was still under fire. Snoad was down across the road. Bolden was bleeding from 3 wounds in his torso. The men inside the house had survived 2 grenades, watched 20 of their number die in the first few seconds, and still they would not come out. Whatever they were waiting for, it was not rescue. Kampfgruppe Piper was already making its last stand 8 kilometers up the valley. No reinforcement was coming. They were staying inside because the alternative was surrender to a soldier they had just shot 3 times, and they had apparently decided that the odds inside the house were better than the odds outside it. He picked up his weapon. The citation uses a single word that military documents have no business being poetic about, and yet somehow this one is. It says he walked back in. Not charged. Not rushed. Walked. A man with a stomach wound cannot run without tearing the injury wider, but you can walk. You can put one foot in front of the other, keep the weapon up, and keep going. Paul Bolden walked back through the door of that farmhouse. He killed the remaining 15 SS soldiers. He worked through the room until his ammunition ran out. When the last shot was fired, 35 Waffen SS men lay dead in and around that building. The position that had pinned an entire American infantry company was silent. "Company," I began to move. If you want to know what happened to Paul Bolden after he walked back out of that house, please subscribe now and keep watching. Every subscriber keeps this channel going and helps make sure that men like Paul Bolden are not forgotten. Bolden was evacuated by medics within the hour. 3 bullet wounds to the shoulder, chest and stomach should by every medical probability have killed him. Penicillin had only recently reached frontline American units in any quantity. Field surgery in Belgium in December of 1944 was brutal, cold and imprecise. He survived through a combination of fast evacuation and early antibiotic treatment, and was moved back through army hospitals over the months that followed. Russell Snoad's official date of death is recorded as December 25, 1944, 2 days after the action at Petit-Coo. Whether he died at the roadside or during evacuation to a field hospital, the surviving records do not resolve. He was eventually interred at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, approximately 40 kilometers from where he fell. He rests there today in Block B, Row 5, Grave 36. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, the second highest military decoration the United States can give, under 9th Army General Orders No. 117 of 1945. The citation credits him with extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. What it does not describe in detail, the Medal of Honor citation for Paul Bolden describes in his place. Snoad crossed 200 yards of open ground under machine gun fire, set up alone in an exposed position across the road, and held that position until the moment a German burst ended his life. He never went home to Massachusetts. While Bolden recovered in army hospitals, the battle around him resolved. On the night of December 23, going into December 24, with American artillery pounding La Glaise and fighter bombers finally back in the air, Joachim Paper made the decision that ended his campaign. He could not hold the village. His relief columns had failed to break through. His fuel was gone. At 2 in the morning on December 24, he began moving his surviving men out on foot through the forest south of La Glaise, leaving behind 135 vehicles, including 6 of his King Tiger tanks, his wounded, and the American prisoners he had been holding. Per the accounts gathered by military historians David Cook and Wayne Evans, 800 of Paper's men began that march. 770 reached German lines at Wanne after a 36-hour walk through snow and forest. From the roughly 4,800 men who had crossed into Belgium 9 days earlier, that was all that remained of Kampfgruppe Peiper as a fighting force. The German offensive in the northern sector was finished. Peiper's force, which had been the sharpest point of Hitler's entire offensive in the west, had been stopped, encircled, bled dry, and forced to abandon its vehicles and walk home through the forest on Christmas Eve. The fuel depots it had been sent to capture were never reached. The Meuse River it had been sent to cross was never seen. The timetable that the entire German plan depended on had collapsed in the Amblève Valley against the men of the 30th Division and the 82nd Airborne. The shoulder that mattered, the one the 30th Division and the 82nd Airborne had held from the very first hour, never broke. Bastogne held in the south centre of the salient and became the famous story. But the northern shoulder, held by Old Hickory in the snow around Malmedy and Stavelot and the Amblève Valley, was where the timetable of Hitler's offensive was broken first. It was broken by ordinary men from ordinary places who held their ground when there was no particular reason to believe holding was possible. Paul Bolden was still in hospital when the last shots in the Ardennes were fired. He missed the rest of the war. In May of 1945, while still in army medical care, he married a young woman named Violet Lorene Alexander in New Hope, Alabama. She was 18. He was 22. They had been engaged before the war. He had written her letters from France and Belgium and Germany, the same kind of careful letters that went out from every army post office to every small town in America, saying enough and not too much. 3 months later, on August 23, 1945, with Germany defeated and Japan 10 days from the formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, President Harry Truman gathered 28 United States Army Medal of Honor recipients in the East Room of the White House for what was at that time the largest single Medal of Honor ceremony of the Second World War. Major General Edward Witzel, the acting Adjutant General, Read each citation aloud. Among the 28 that morning were soldiers who had charged machine guns in France, held mountain positions in Italy, and carried out actions across a dozen campaigns in 2 theatres. When Witzel reached the name Paul Bolden and read the words of the citation aloud, the room heard the number 35. 35 SS soldiers in a Belgian farmhouse. 1 fragmentation grenade and 1 white phosphorus grenade, 20 killed on the first entry. 3 bullet wounds in the body. A wait outside the door to offer the survivors a chance to surrender. And then the walk back in. Truman pinned the pale blue ribbon around Bolden's neck and shook his hand. Bolden, a quiet man by every biographical account, accepted the medal and returned to his seat. The formal General Orders, War Department General Orders No. 73, were published on August 30, 1 week after the ceremony. That date appears in many historical records, which is why both dates are sometimes cited. The ceremony came first. The paperwork followed. Bolden was eventually promoted to Master Sergeant and honorably discharged. He brought Violet home to a farm near Ardmore, on the Tennessee state line, about 18 miles north of Huntsville, along Alabama Highway 53. They had children. He planted fields. He fished the same rivers he had fished as a boy. The farm was not far from Hobbs Island Road. He had not traveled very far in the end. But he had seen things that almost nobody from that county had seen, and done things that almost nobody anywhere had done, and he kept most of it to himself. He took a civilian job at Redstone Arsenal, the army installation on the southern edge of Huntsville that would become, within a decade, the home of the American rocket program. Wernher von Braun and his team of engineers and scientists built their first operational rockets there in the 1950s. The Jupiter C rocket that launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, in January of 1958, was tested at Redstone. The Redstone rocket that carried Alan Shepard on America's first human spaceflight in May of 1961 was built there. Paul Bolden worked in procurement packaging at the same facility through all of it, through Sputnik and Explorer 1 and the Mercury flights, and the early years of Apollo. He drove the same 18 miles of Alabama Highway 53 to work nearly every day, past the fields and the roadside farms, through the same light that fell on that part of Alabama every morning, the same as it had when he was a boy, ploughing rows along Farley Road. The man who had crawled 200 yards through Belgian snow on a December morning and killed 35 SS soldiers alone, went home every evening to the same county he had been born in, and never said much about any of it. He kept his medals in a drawer. Think about that for a moment. The United States Army had given Paul Bolden its highest decoration. He had received it from the President of the United States in a ceremony in the East Room of the White House in front of 27 other men who had done extraordinary things. The citation describing his action had been read aloud in that room and entered into the permanent record of the United States military. And he went home and put the medal in a drawer and went back to work. There is no record of him ever displaying it, or speaking about it to neighbors, or giving an account of December 23, 1944, to any journalist or historian who asked. He just lived his life in Madison County, Alabama, the same way he had lived it before the war, except that now he drove 18 miles to work every morning instead of walking to the end of Farley Road. He did not write a memoir. He gave no recorded interviews about what happened at Petit-Coo. He attended no major 30th Division reunions. He did not seek recognition from the press or the government or anyone else. The local veterans post in Madison County knew who he was. Outside of that, and outside of the families of the men who had been with him in Company 1, almost no one did. In 1963, President John Kennedy held the annual White House military reception on May 2nd and invited all living Medal of Honor recipients. Kennedy spoke that afternoon to 240 of the 290 living recipients gathered on the grounds. He remarked that it was almost certainly the largest gathering of Medal of Honor holders in American history, brought together in one place at one time. Bolden wanted to attend. The family could not afford the trip from Alabama to Washington. Local businessmen in Huntsville quietly covered the travel costs themselves so that Madison County's most decorated veteran could stand on the White House grounds with the others. Bolden made the trip, shook the president's hand, and came home. In May of 1979, Paul Bolden was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He went into surgery at Huntsville Hospital. He never fully regained consciousness after the operation. He died on the morning of May 21, 1979, from complications of that surgery. He was 56 years old, born on a river bend in Alabama, buried near the same river bend in Alabama, with most of what he had done still unknown to the country he had done it for. The Huntsville Times ran the obituary on page 1 below the fold the following morning. It named him Madison County's most decorated veteran of the Second World War. The funeral was small. He was buried at Moon Cemetery in Owens Cross Roads, Alabama, a few miles from where he had been born. There was no national coverage. There was no ceremony beyond what the family arranged. There was a grave and a name on it, and the quiet that follows when a man who did not want to be noticed finally is not. For years after that, almost nothing. The 30th Infantry Division earned 6 Medals of Honor in the Second World War, 65 Distinguished Service Crosses, 1,718 Silver Stars, 6,319 Bronze Stars, and approximately 20,000 Purple Hearts across its entire combat tour. These are not abstract numbers. They are the precise and documented cost of what the old Hickory Division gave to the campaign that ended the war in Europe. Historians who studied that campaign recognized the division as the one the Germans themselves came to call Roosevelt's SS, a name recorded in the division's post-war literature as a reluctant acknowledgement of the 30th's ferocity in the field. The German command, which had faced the best American units from Normandy to the Rhine, singled out this particular division for that particular distinction. And yet outside the veterans' community and a handful of regional newspapers, the division's story never broke into popular culture the way the stories of the 82nd or 101st Airborne did. No major film told the story of the stand at Mortain. No series told the story of the Malmedy Triangle and the men who held it. Part of the reason is geography and timing. The Bulge story that became famous was Bastogne, defended by the 101st Airborne, famously surrounded, famously resupplied by air, famously told to go to hell when the Germans asked for surrender. That story had a single location, a single dramatic line, and a general, Anthony McAuliffe, whose one-word reply became the most quoted sentence of the entire Western campaign. The story of the Northern Shoulder had none of that. It had a division holding a line along a river valley through snow and darkness, fighting a battle that mattered enormously but that never compressed into a single famous moment. The men who held it did not write memorable dispatches. They just held. That is harder to turn into a film than a siege, and it is harder to remember than a single-word answer to a surrender demand. The 30th Division was deactivated after the war. Its veterans scattered. They went back to North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama and got on with their lives the same way Paul Bolden got on with his. They did not particularly seek attention. The division's official history, written shortly after the war ended, documented what they had done in careful detail. And then the decades passed, and the Korean War came, and then Vietnam, and the men of the 30th got older, and their numbers thinned, and the story sat in the archives waiting for someone to go looking for it, and Paul Bolden's name, specifically, sat quiet for decades. It was a local historian named John Rankin who began pulling it back into the light, writing biographical accounts for the Huntsville History Collection and the Madison County Record in the early 2000s. The Andalusia Star News picked up the story. Military history websites followed. Slowly, piece by piece, the account of December 23, 1944 began to circulate again. On May 18, 2013, 34 years after Paul Bolden died, an 18-mile stretch of Alabama Highway 53, running from Research Park Boulevard in Huntsville, south toward Ardmore, was officially designated the Paul Luther Bolden Memorial Highway. It is the same road he drove to Redstone Arsenal nearly every working day for more than 25 years. The Veterans Memorial Museum in Huntsville named its military building in his honor. The Madison County Courthouse added his likeness to its Hall of Heroes. But there is no permanent monument in Petit-Coo. If you drive the road between Stavelot and the Cascades de Cou today, you pass through that hamlet without noticing it. A few stone houses, a railway halt, a sign for the waterfall a kilometre further on. In La Glaise, 8 kilometres up the valley, one of Paper's King Tiger tanks, hull number 213, still sits beside the December 1944 museum, exactly where it was abandoned on Christmas Eve of 1944. Tourists stop and photograph it. They do not, mostly, stop for the road where an American sergeant from Alabama crawled 200 yards through December snow and walked through a door alone. There is no plaque on that farmhouse. There is no marker at that crossroads. Here is what that door in Petit-Coo actually means. The Battle of the Bulge was not won at Bastogne alone. It was won in many places at once, by ordinary squads and platoons holding ground that should have been given up, at costs that should have been too high to pay. The northern shoulder of the battle, the one that broke Kampfgruppe Peiper's schedule inside the first 48 hours, was held not by elite airborne troops, but by men from North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia and Alabama, who had been fighting since the hedgerows of June and were now being asked to hold a frozen Belgian valley against the best armoured force Hitler had left. They held it. Paul Bolden's action at Petit-Coo was one hinge on which a larger thing turned, a company pinned in the snow. 2 men who crawled 200 yards without orders. A door opened. 35 SS soldiers who refused to come out. A company that could move again. A road that could be cleared. A line that held. But the detail that matters most in this story is not the number 35. It is what happened outside the door. In a week when American units in other sectors had seen orders circulate stating that SS troops were to be shot on sight, when the bodies of 84 murdered Americans still lay in a Belgian field, when every man in that valley had a direct and personal reason to want every member of the Leibstandarte division dead, Paul Bolden stood outside that house and gave the survivors a chance to walk out with their hands up. He gave them the one thing their own division had denied American prisoners at Bognes Crossroads 6 days before. He honoured a rule his enemy had abandoned. They refused it. He killed them. But the sequence matters. The pause is not a footnote. It is the line between what Paul Bolden was and what the men who gave orders at Bognes had shown themselves to be. He came home to Alabama. He drove that highway for decades. His medals stayed in a drawer. His neighbours knew him as a farmer, a government worker, and a quiet man who liked to hunt and fish. He did not ask for anything more than what the farm and the river and the ordinary passing of days could give him. Madison County's most decorated veteran of the Second World War filled out procurement paperwork at a rocket facility, drove home in the evenings along a road that would one day carry his name, and did not tell anyone what he had done. The highway they named for him in 2013 runs through the same fields he grew up near. It is 18 miles long. There are no fanfares on it, no statues. Just a road sign with his name, and the land moving past on either side the same way it did when he was a boy walking to school past those same fields on those same mornings. That is the right kind of monument for a man like Paul Bolden. Staff Sergeant Paul Luther Bolden, Company 1, 3rd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, Medal of Honor, Silver Star. Bronze Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, 2 Purple Hearts, Belgian Croix de Guerre with palm. Born June 15, 1922. Died May 21, 1979. Buried at Moon Cemetery, Owens Cross Roads, Alabama. 35 SS soldiers in a Belgian farmhouse, 3 bullet wounds in his body, 1 comrade down across the road, 1 pause at the door to offer surrender, and then he walked back in. Most people will never hear that name. That is where you come in. Hit the like button right now. Every like pushes this story to someone who has never heard of Paul Bolden, and he has waited long enough. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we go through Medal of Honor citations, after-action reports, and unit histories looking for men exactly like him, men whose names never made the documentaries, men whose stories sat in filing cabinets while the world moved on. We pull them out and we tell them. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Poland. We have viewers on every continent, and every comment, every share, every like keeps these stories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us their name and their branch. This comment section is a roll call, and every name on it matters. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for making sure that Staff Sergeant Paul Luther Bolden gets the one thing a medal and a highway in Alabama could never quite give him on their own. Someone to remember the morning he walked back through that door.